one of the things that I'm intrigued by, and one of the things that draws me into this type of practice is that I guess after many years of going to of 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 working within a more, dare I say, kind of conventional type of art practice, specifically located around Latin America, and seeing, going to art fairs and the biennials and doing so much of that circuit over a period of about 8 years. Um, uh, I've seen, I tend to see the distinctions between these types of social practice, community-based practice initiatives in Latin America and the previous type of practices that I had been engaged in. I see them in these sort of stark contrasts sometimes, and maybe it's overly simplifying, but to me they're accentuated by the fact that that I've seen this type of distinction, and so I can't help but notice um, uh, some of those differences when I think about how I would define social practice. And so some of those distinctions are uh, really a deep-seated commitment to the communicability of art, um, uh, to a larger base of a community than, let's say, the normal traditional art world is used to or comfortable with. And that is somehow a sort of a pedagogical imperative that I think is really important to think about, because the fact that we are very often talking about dialogue, we're talking about pedagogy, we're talking about community, when we're talking about social practice, right? Those are three very common terms that find themselves in the discussion. Those things can't be dismissed because they're there for a reason. And those I think are the reasons, because there is that imperative, this pedagogical, dialogical imperative to reach out to a community, and that's, I think, that the main distinction. Whereas, um, and rather than try to disparage other forms of art making, I'll just say that that's really where the crux of the argument lies for me, and that to me is very, very important. Um, from a Latin American perspective, it's important because there are so many more distinct and very different challenges that are happening in various regions of Latin America, that where these types of efforts can really, really affect social change in a very profound way. Whether you're talking about memory recuperation and civic reintegration in Colombia, or you're talking about indigenous-based activism and environmental remediation in Ecuador or in Argentina. I mean, whatever the regions are, there are local histories in which these types of socially based processes of social practice can really, really make an impact and expand the discourse of art in really interesting ways. And those distinctions, I think, are kind of the parameters in which I would define social practice, I think.
Thank you. Could you give us a concrete example that's intersecting with your work and investigation at the moment, or two, either
Sure,
contemporary or historical?
sure. Um, there's a there's a few I'm thinking about. I just curated this biennial called the MD11, the Encuentro Internacional de Medellín, in Medellín, Colombia. And um, excuse me, after spending 2 years there, uh, doing this work for this project, the theme of the biennial was pedagogy, and we took a term from Paulo Freire's work as a sort of framing context for the biennial. And you realize the extent to which, um, even without the art world's support or interest or input, so many young activists, emerging artists, musicians, civic planners, people of all different types of disciplines have entered into a type of social practice sort of methodology in which to engage the community around some of the issues that Medellin was trying to deal with. Um, you know, after many decades of violence, the question of, for example, memory recuperation is such a central issue. Um, and of course, it comes hand in hand with like a more larger civic conversation that, for example, 30% of the state of Antioquia, which is the state in which Medellin is the capital, 30% of the state of Antioquia's GDP goes towards education programming. That's a staggering number. And so there's all of these types of interesting possibilities for artists to open up what they call corporaciones, these types of NGOs, these types of nonprofit spaces, which there's music schools, there's community theater, there's community video making, all these different groups that are acting in this type of social practice type of methodology. But no one's there to actually tell them that. They just do it. And so when you go there and you try to engage in a project where you're bringing in artists from the outside and bringing in all these types of theorists and people from the art world to learn from these types of practices, you understand how much the art world really has to learn sometimes. And that's a really wonderful thing, to bring in various different communities together to do these types of works. And so that just showed to me that there's something really, that question of communicability is really, really important and really rich.
Thank you.
Sure.